So officially, welcome everyone. My name is Prof, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on the next seminar of 19th century organized by the Department of Modern World History of the Institute of History of Jagiellonian University. I assume that is our last meeting that academic year. Yes, Adam said yes. So, and I hope the next one in autumn will be normally in institute and not via MS Teams. So the today lecture, as well the tomorrow one at the same time, is organized thanks to the CEPUS network, intellectual collaboration in Central and Southeast Europe in modern period, which coordinator is us, the 19th century seminar, Dr. Adam Świątek. Now, a few words about our guest. Professor Naouma Kaytcheva is Bulgarian historian and diplomat, head of the Department of History of Byzantine and Balkan Nations of the Sofii University, Saint Klimenta Ochrydzkiego. In 1999, 2002, he was the Consul General of Republic of Bulgaria in Toronto, in Canada. And in 2007-2010 in Bitola, nowadays Republic of North Macedonia. From 2018, and it is really important, he is vice chairman of the bilateral Bulgarian Northern Macedonian Commission for Historical and Educational Affairs, so really important body which deal with the cooperation between North Macedonia and Bulgaria to Macedonian access to European Union. Professor Naouma Kaytcheva is specialist mostly on the history of Southeastern Europe and the question linked to the nationalism, identity, and Southern Slavdom. I think it is enough for introduction, and we can start our lecture. I give the floor to the professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Popek. Thank you very much, Dr. Świątek. It's a real pleasure to be with you, though virtually, but still with the heart and intellectually with in Krakow in the Jagiellonian University. I used to visit that establishment before, but not with your faculty, so I'm very glad that I'm now with my fellow historians today. I will present some of my findings that I researched some times ago, connected with some parallels and differences in nation building in Serbia and Bulgaria. Especially for you coming from east of Europe, from Poland, I suppose it's very well understandable what actually the similarities between Serbia and Bulgaria are, especially in view of that a little bit old-fashioned division between East and West nations in Europe, or between ethnic and state nations on the continent. In this respect, of course, although of course this division is quite criticized, but nevertheless, both Serbia and Bulgaria, like most of Eastern Europe, share main characteristics. But speaking about theoretical orientations of the this empirical presentation today, of course, we could not but still link our discussion with certain, I suppose now you see the presentation and everything's fine.
Yes, it is correct.
Good, good. So we could not but link our debate with theoretical discussions in general on the origin of the nations. Of all the different theoretical approaches, which are quite more in number, but nevertheless we should just mention for the peace, for clarity, some of the three major theoretical approaches. Of course, during the recent decades, most fashionable is the postmodernist approach of the followers of Benedict Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm, for whom the nation is first mostly an imagined community, post-18th century construction that is mainly created by certain activists and national creators. This division, of course, is countered, and this approach is countered and preceded by the view of modernists like Gellner and Tom Nern and Karl Deutsch, for whom the nation is also a post-18th century product, but it is not the accidental creature of cultural workers or awakeners, but it follows from certain fundamental social, economical, and cultural laws of modernity or turning of traditional into modern societies. And thirdly, of course, we should not forget the ethno-symbolist view of scholars like Anthony Smith, for whom the nation could emerge well in early modern times, and for whom it is an interplay between different objective and subjective factors, but where ethnicity, or ethnic heritage to be more precise, has an important role to play. In our discussion, we would analyze the thinking or building of Bulgarian and Serbian nation as it was disseminated by two of the most important state institutions after the Congress of Berlin. But before continuing with the core of our lecture, let me just remind you some of the basic features of on the Balkan Peninsula we are discussing today. You see on this map an approximate ethnographic map of the Balkan Peninsula. This is a French map from the second part of the 19th century, and you see here that the populations are very much intermingled, and it's not that easy to recreate a clear ethnic nation state out of them. Of course, most of you well know that Serbia emerged as autonomous state, as autonomous principality, well before Bulgaria. On this map, you see the political situation on the Balkans between 1833 and 1877, where we have Greece, but also Serbia as autonomous state, especially Serbia is autonomous, whereas Bulgaria is a province within Ottoman Empire, still divided into different vilayates. And of course, all that changed with the great Eastern crisis of 1875-1878, with certain important uprising taking place, diplomatic actions, war between Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, with certain Polish regiments, I suppose, also taking part into this war. And ultimately, we have firstly a treaty of San Stefano. You see here the borders with yellow borders that establish a kind of Greater Bulgaria, but and also, of course, enlarge Serbia and Montenegro. But of course, this was a preliminary treaty that finally was cancelled by the Great Berlin Congress of July 1878, and finally the final settlement in the Balkans, as well as in certain other parts of the Ottoman Empire in Asia and Africa, was reached about in July 1878 and the years that followed. As you see, in 1878, a province south of the Principality of the Autonomous Principality of Bulgaria was created. This was province of Eastern Rumelia, or Rumelia Oriental. But this province, which was predominantly Bulgarian populated, in fact existed only for about 7 years, and in 1885, as you all probably know, was reunified with Bulgaria. And this is mostly the map of the period that we'll discuss, with autonomous Bulgaria in theory, but in fact quite independent. The formal independence came about in 1908. And the neighboring Serbia. To the south, we see Greece, and all three countries very deeply interested in the regions between them in the Ottoman Empire. Most of them, of course, are in the geographical constitute what was then the geographical province of Macedonia, divided into several Ottoman vilayets with centers in Salonika, in Bitula or Monastir, or in Skopje. As you see on this map, Bulgaria, though quite late established, was somewhat larger. In territory, it was nearly twice larger than Serbia, and in population about quota, about 25–30%. Here you see the exact numbers of the demographic potential of the Principality of Bulgaria and Kingdom of Serbia in the period we will be discussing, mainly the period between 1885 and the Balkan Wars of 1912. Starting our discussion about the transformation of those societies, we should point out that both countries were peasant countries with very great preponderance of the population in the countryside that basically lived out on agriculture, and especially in the initial years after the Congress of Berlin, in both countries the literacy rates were very, very low, about let's put it about 4% in both countries. Also in Serbia, despite Serbia being autonomous state with its own statehood for nearly half a decade. So therefore, we have a situation where we witness a process similar into other parts of Europe, which were quite vividly outlined several decades ago by Eugene Weber in his monograph Peasants into Frenchmen. So in this case, now we could see that somewhat similar process were happening, and peasants were turning into Bulgarians and Serbians. But of course, the main task, the main job of influencing the new this peasant population was accomplished by the educational systems in both countries. As I already mentioned, Serbia was not different from Bulgarian lands despite its previous existence as autonomous states. During the 3.5 decades under question, both systems were upgraded under the same scheme. Central governments in Sofia and Belgrade provided financial and administrative resources for growth and strength of the school network, building a very centralized pyramidal system. In legislative terms, both states simultaneously introduced compulsory elementary schooling, Bulgaria in 1879, Serbia in 1882. Of course, to a very large extent, this was only on paper, and in fact, the states struggled actually to implement that in theory compulsory system. Nevertheless, both states invested proportionally more resources in the secondary school rather than in the elementary or post-elementary one. That attitude of looking more to the elite than to the masses was extended in both countries, but was especially true for Serbia, where this statute was manifested with the separate word, professor, and even in former Yugoslavia, even today, this word professor means not only university, but also a teacher in gymnasii, in high schools, in secondary schools in former Yugoslav countries. The household of the peasants in both countries was to the great extent natural. In both societies, the hereditary aristocracy of the upper class did not exist. Only artisans, merchants, or economic middle class, or public servants, officers, professional and teachers, or we could describe them as an educated middle class. Only these stratas could be distinguished from the peasant mass. The self-confidence of this town-oriented group was increased by their cultural and social advantage over the peasants, by their grip on the capital and economic growth, and by their monopoly on the political power. The fate of the postulated drive towards general schooling was decided where the vast majority of the population lived, in the countryside. The school inspectors' reports, both in Serbia and Bulgaria, create a vivid picture of peasant hostility towards the schools imposed by the center. This rejection or this skepticism was very moderate in Bulgaria and more extreme in Serbia. Hence, the results in different cases varied. The literacy rates, actually, we have a very interesting work, very interesting tool to appreciate the impact of the educational systems. In the statistic yearbooks, we have the data on the literacy of the person who went into marriage, and as we presume that these were predominantly young people between 20 and 25 years of age. So you see on the slide the literacy rates for 1907-08 among the newlywed, and you see that the numbers for Bulgaria are somewhat higher, and 48 versus 32% for literacy for the newlywed. with, of course, bigger percentage among grooms and quite lower among brides, with 27 versus 13% literacy among the brides in Serbia. The other statistic, which was carefully prepared in those times, was that of the persons that were conscripted in the army. And we have such statistic for the final year before, in fact, of the Balkan Wars. And here the divergence is also quite clear. In Bulgaria, we have nearly all male literacy, 87% versus 57% in Serbia. And that illiteracy is to a certain extent caused by the Muslim conscripts in Bulgaria that were predominantly illiterate. Thus, the Bulgarian educational system achieved more impressive results in its effort to embrace the population. By 1912, as you see, more than 9/10 of ethnic Bulgarians called to the colors were literate. Bulgarian pattern could be explained with more decisive and concentrated state efforts. On the other hand, it is clear that neither legislation nor the state financial efforts were sufficient to achieve such result. One could suppose great openness of the Bulgarian village and greater acceptance of the influences of the wider foreign world. In fact, if we want to see what was actually the content of the education of the time, the most usual source that is analyzed, and of course one of the most sure source actually is the content of the textbooks that were used in the school system. Usually we historians tend to concentrate on the history textbooks, but if we see the system, the school system of that time, of course we should concentrate on other type of textbooks, because in the primary school, which is our special focus today, of course, we could not, of course, underestimate the influence of secondary schools that actually created mostly the elite of the society. But if we think about the elementary schools, then, of course, the textbooks, the manuals in the maternal and the national language, respective Serbian and Bulgarian, were the most important, because in the first grades, in the first, in the second, in the third grade, it was the primers, the readers that were the mostly widely read textbooks by the pupils. In fact, only in the third grade, but mostly in the fourth grade, came the first years of a kind of history teaching content, but mostly it was the history was taught in progymnasia, that means at the second level in the post-elementary school system, and this system, this level was reached by relatively few peoples, especially in Serbia. So our attention, and especially in this talk, would be focused especially on the textbooks in Serbian and Bulgarian. Beginning from its earlier editions, Serbian school books built the image of the fatherland and of the consciousness of the national unity by recalling the memories of the common past. Especially convenient was the epic cycle recreating heroic episodes of Serbian history during the last decades before submission under the Turks. In one of the textbooks, and this textbook was compiled by one of the most prominent intellectuals of the time, Stoyan Novakovic, who was a prominent literature figure, historian, and intellectual by definition, but he also compiled the textbooks, and in fact, these folk songs occupied 1/4 of the total book. Dispersed throughout the edition, they form the basic essential core. The epics glorify the heroic deeds of the mythical or real Serbian rulers like Kraljević Marko. This was, I hope you are well aware, symbolical figure from the 14th century, who was a real personality but turned into all Balkan historical folklore figure, known in Bulgaria as Kralj Marko, in Serbia as Kraljević Marko. Prince Lazar, Brother Jugovic, and other figures from the Kosovo cycle. Especially fascinating for the young peoples was the example of one of the Serbian personalities or heroes from the Battle of Kosovo back in 1389, Miloš Obilić, who at that battle allegedly killed the Turkish Sultan Murad, sacrificing his life to that end. The mobilizing effect of these stories from the Kosovo cycle was beyond doubt. By glorifying the past powerful state, they had the potential to unite on religion and ethnic basis all Serbs, creating in the process the image of the old and natural Turk or Muslim enemy. The first editions placed the stories in the medieval past, but from 1880s on, the textbooks gradually shifted the epic representation. Kosovo was no more an image created only by the songs on the 14th century. The folk Kosovo was gradually multiplied in the stories on the more recent Serbian history. The numerous stories on the two early 19th century Serbian uprisings that brought about the new Serbian statehood recreated their heroes as copies of the Kosovo ones. The epic motif reached its climax during the first decade of the 20th century. For example, one of the textbooks, and this was for the progymnasia, for the post-elementary level, devoted 39% of its pages to the folk historical stories. On the other hand, in Bulgarian, these stories on the past also became and were part of the literature school books. Some paid attention and had a special section on history. Yet, even in those cases, that share was modestly between 9 and 17%. The history stories were noticeable but not dominating motif in the efforts for educating national feeling and consciousness. Furthermore, the Bulgarian history texts were of different origin and nature. In contrast with Serbia, Bulgaria did not provide strong folk motifs of the medieval past, and school books very modestly used the epics. Instead, they tended to borrow from the high historiographic tradition of the 19th century that was being created mainly in Habsburg Empire by Venelin and especially by Konstantin Irecek, the famous Czech scholar. Thus, the Serbian welding of folklore, history, and geography was not executed in Bulgaria. So, what was the main message of Bulgarian readers, of Bulgarian primers, how they recreated the image of the national self? In fact, the most important image of Bulgaria was this approach through nature. Bulgarian textbooks ceaselessly brought to the fore the beauty of Bulgarian mountains, rivers, fields, valleys. In fact, even today, most of the important songs of the nation, even the hymn of Bulgaria, is especially concentrated on the nature, on geography. It starts with proud Stara Planina, and the mountain, the Balkan mountain, Stara Planina mountain, is to a certain extent one of the most important symbol of Bulgarianness, together, of course, with other elements of this natural beauty. These qualities were transferred on the whole of motherland, and on the people, on the ethnic community itself. Thus, they formed some of the most intimate feelings of the individual. And of course, in this production, the national poet, the national writer, Ivan Vazov, was very instrumental, and his verses very often were printed, were included into the primaries, into the readers, into different textbooks in Bulgarian literature. So he was indeed very influential in making Bulgarians of the time understanding and reaffirming their Bulgarianness. One important notion is the image of the region of Macedonia within the two school systems. In Serbia itself, to a certain extent, probably surprisingly, during the first decade we discussing, still Macedonia is somewhat of a terra incognita inherited by certain foreign people, non-Serbians. This is not by case, because until very well into the second half of 19th century, approximately until 1868, Serbian society and Serbian official policy perceived Macedonia indeed as somewhat foreign land, populated either by Greeks or by certain similar Slavonic Bulgarian brethren, but not by Serbs. And it was only after 1868 that a planned Serbian policy towards Macedonia for spreading Serbian education and consciousness began. And we see that the educational system is somewhat in delay, and even in 1880s it recreates certain older editions where where Macedonia is presented as a non-Serbian land, and it was only in 1890s where new school primaries, readers, textbooks in Serbian literature were created that definitely changed the image of Macedonia. And once again, here the folk historical motifs of the past were indeed recreated, and it was transformed into the country of Stefan Dusan and Marko Kraljevic, Indeed, the textbooks emphasize that the medieval Tsar, or the only emperor of Serbia, Stefan Dusan, in mid-14th century, actually was crowned in the city of Skopje, or afterwards he was prominent in that region, or one of the feudal inheritor, his feudal inheritors, Prince Marko Kralevich, actually came from Prilep, and he was the person in very prominent in the Balkan folk epic, but was perceived mostly as a Serbian in Serbian folk tradition. On the other hand, the Bulgarians quite expectedly raised the beauty of the contemporary land of Macedonia. That means mainly of certain mountains like Pirin, of rivers like Vardar, Struma, Mesta, like lakes Ohrid and Prespa. So also the other image was raised, the image of contemporary, very pure or purist Bulgarians that actually inhabit the province of Macedonia and that are suffering under the foreign yoke, as the textbooks were presenting and discussing. And this motive was intermingled, of course, also with certain historical positivist narration on the Bulgarian past of Macedonia, but once again it was taken from certain positivist accounts that were adopting the big history of Bulgaria by Konstantin Irecek. Speaking about, and once again, let me emphasize that the most important images, most important work for creating national consciousness, making oneself as Bulgarian or Serbian, was accomplished by textbooks in national language. Whereas speaking about history textbooks, they were, of course, prominent on the post-elementary level in progymnasia and for the elites in gymnasia. And once again, we will see similar patterns being recreated. Bulgarian textbooks authored, in fact, more or less adapted the big history of Bulgaria written in 1876 by Konstantin Irecek. So what was following was a kind of adaptation of that model. And despite romantic purposes of the textbook's writing, the rationalist and positivist roots of the reading were clearly discernible. On the other hand, in Serbia, these popular epics still have preserved its preserved place even in the history textbooks. More important was the adoption of certain general visions on the historical development which were transplanted from epics into the Serbian history textbooks. Mixture of the past and present, constant immutability with the cyclically repeating events, centrality of the internal static structures like family, people, state. Now we are reaching geography textbooks, which were which was actually the subject that was closest to the official state policy of the day, And we could see it very clearly in the Serbian case, where immediately after the Congress of Berlin, the outlook of those textbooks changed with the new image of Macedonia imposed. Whereas for the literature textbooks, it took the whole decade to change the content. In this case, in Serbia and in Bulgaria as well, we see a kind of more or less codified list of certain territories that are supposed to be Serbian or respectively Bulgarian, and which are unredeemed. That means that they are perceived to be populated by the brethren of the similar ethnic stock called Serbians, called Bulgarians, and should be unified into the perceived big state. So in the Serbian case, we have the list of 12 so-called Serbian lands, Srpske zemlje, and these are as follows. And here I will show, this is the page of one of the Serbian primaries of the textbooks of that time in geography. And this is actually the list of those Serbian lands. So you see that apart from the Kingdom of Serbia, it includes also of course, Montenegro, but Vojvodina is not known as a singular province by that name, and instead we have Banat, which includes also a part of today's Romania. We have Srem and we have Bačka. All these lands were part of the Hungary within the Habsburg or Austro-Hungarian monarchy of the time. We have, of course, as Serbian Bosnia, Herzegovina, Slavonia, Croatia, Dalmatia, and even Peninsula of Istria. And to the south, we have as Serbian land also Old Serbia and Macedonia. In certain textbooks, not in all of them, but in certain, a 12 Serbian land is included. This is the Western Bulgaria, or more precisely, the Vidin and Sofia district, which are also presented as populated by Serbians. On the other hand, in Bulgaria, we have very rarely or no similar map of big San Stefano, Bulgaria, but usually the different parts of Bulgaria, of this big Bulgaria, are presented. And here we see one map of the territories within Serbia in the valleys of rivers Morava or Timok, which are close to the Bulgarian border and perceived as populated by Bulgarians. In reality, of course, this is quite a longer story, but in reality, these territories were largely pre-modern in pre-Berlin, pre-1878 period, with Niš and Leskovac, its major towns, going into Serbian national direction, and Pirot being a Bulgarian town. But of course, after the incorporation of these regions into Serbia, they were subjected to that method of Serbian nation building I'm describing, and were more or less swiftly Serbianized. In fact, the reports from the inspectors in different regions very often complain that the work in this region is somewhat harder than in the core of Serbia, that here there are very low level of folk songs recreated, and songs that habits are somewhat different, language is quite different and improper Serbians and so on and so on. But nevertheless, more or less in that period, in 35 years, this process of nation building, of Serbian nation building in those territories was more or less accomplished. And this is the opposite, the mirror map from the Serbian textbooks that recreates, that presents the Vidin district with the city of Vidin on the Danube, and also the Sredec district, that means Sofia district, that are presented as Serbian lands that supposedly should be one day united with the mother state. All we know, the educational system, of course, was quite instrumental and influential for changing the national mood, the national perception of the bulk of the population. But of course, there were other tools of the state at hand that also worked in this direction, and especially important was the role of the army. By being subject to the general military service, an overwhelming majority of the male population was forced to abandon its usual pace of life and to spend a year and a half or two in the army. Thus, the young Bulgarian and Serbian men made the first steps outside the familiar world of the village and had to interact within the larger novel social communities. He was intensively exposed to the new images, notions, and ideas. Of course, sometimes we tend to exaggerate the grasp of the army if we look into reports and statistics of the time. In fact, we see that there was quite more young population, more boys than army could absorb. And of course, there were also economical or health reasons for exclusion of certain portions. So in Bulgarian case, between 27 and 52% of Bulgarian young males went to the barracks. We have no certain statistic from Serbia, but judging from the other figures like number of the population, of the total population, or the number of the conscripts, or more or less the figures are not that different in Serbia, but nevertheless, still large part of the male population went to the barrack, to the army. We had at that time the conscript army in both states. Both armies maintained a process of moral training of soldiers, making conscripts into patriots that believed in their belonging to the nation and were expected to sacrifice themselves for it. The more the times advanced towards the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, the more attention was paid to this activity. The volume of formal administrative regulations to this end ceaselessly increased. The change of the soldier's view was achieved by use of different methods. And we had data that evidence that there were direct speeches and lectures to the soldiers given We had also formal hours of education in national spirit in courses for non-commissioned officers. Certain patriotic marches and songs played by military orchestras were very popular at the time. They were sang by soldiers and special choirs. Of course, amateur theater scenes also came to the fore. Especially important were festivities on certain days, like, of course, national days of the two countries. 19 February, the day of San Stefano Treaty for Bulgaria, and 2nd February, the day of uprising in 1804 against the Ottomans in Serbia. Both countries had a kind of national sense that in Serbia, Saint Sava used to be perceived, or in Bulgaria, Saint Cyril and Methodius. These holidays, of course, were mainly cultural, celebrated by educational system, but still military was also involved into this all-nation celebration. And kind of a special honor of the military was the days of regimental celebrations that were taking place for every regiment by its own. Usually a certain important saints, Christian saints, served as the day of the respective Bulgarian court, while in Serbian case this was connected with certain battle. In case of the army service, we could see once again the continuation of the previously observed pattern that the folklore epic was employed to educate the soldier in being loyal to the Serbian nation. We see that from the special literature that was produced by the officers in order to methodologically to explain how to treat the soldiers, and also by the special readers that were created and directed especially to the soldiers in Serbia and in Bulgaria. In both states, a special magazine, a popular magazine, Uzdanica or Hope in Serbia, or Vojniški drugar or Soldier's Comrade in Bulgaria, was edited by the respective Ministry of Defense. And from the content of those magazines, we understand actually what were the messages that officers actually wanted to convey to the conscripts. In fact, both magazines were mainly written by officers who served in the army, and some of them specialized in this soldiers, so to say, military moral education. And in Serbian case, we see we could say a theoretical conclusion that I'm quoting: the Serbian song is an educative reader which contains everything elevated and good that merited mentioning at the time. So quite well into the first decade of 20th century, this folk epic approach was applied in the Serbian army as well. In Bulgarian case, as we could expect, we had a somewhat different approach, which emphasized on the definition of the fatherland of the service to the fatherland and to the prince, that means Prince Ferdinand, after 1908 to the Tsar. And it was understood that this new community, which the peasant, the soldier peasant was introduced in, was the continuation of the natural family of the first family, the soldier's family. So the image of the nation, of the people, was like an extended family, and this explanation of what being a Bulgarian nation or Bulgarian people was transmitted through Bulgarian writings on for the soldier. So if we now turn our attention once again to the theoretical approaches to the nation and nation building, we are tempted to make certain conclusions that in the Serbian case, the role of the ethnic inheritance, the previous ethnic roots, was somewhat larger than in Bulgarian case. In Serbia, as already was described, the cyclical time of the epic was preserved, and a certain sustainability of a kind of, to a certain extent, pre-modern consciousness connected with the Kosovo epic was sustained, and this, of course, was the very interesting Serbian intellectual development connected with the imposition of Vuk Karadžic's version of the spoken type of Serbian language as a literal language of the Serbians. And this type of popular self-identification, to a certain extent pre-modern as a content, was reproduced well into the first decade of 20th century by the modern Serbian national state. Thus, we could say that although in Bulgarian case the role of the previous ethnic memory, the ethnic inheritance of the previous Bulgarian states from the Middle Times still had certain importance. Nevertheless, Bulgarian case is more closer to the models of modernist transformation that were raised by scholars and thinkers such as Gellner. Of course, this dichotomy is very schematic. One could see, of course, many exceptions, but nevertheless, I think this could be a certain guide to our discussion and understanding of the development of Bulgaria and Serbia in late 19th and early 20th century. So at this moment, I will want to stop talking and would be very glad if I could receive from you some thoughts and some questions.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. It was really so. Yes, we can go to the part of questions and discussions. Are there any questions from our audience? we have Victor Ponka who would like to ask the first question. I will give you the floor.
Yes, thank you for lecture, Mr. Professor. I have two questions. I ask first about okay. Otherwise, what was a place in Bulgarian national mythology of medieval Bulgarian state? I want to ask what was a recall how Bulgarians in 19th century recall to their medieval state, their medieval kingdom, and to their nomadic origins, to Bulgarian tribe from Great Steppe. If there was any of that recall in national mythology or in war propaganda. That's my first question. Maybe I ask second after your answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Plonka. If we
only student Plonka.
Oh, okay. So if we speak about we speak obviously about the previous period, about the pre-independence Bulgaria, and in this case, it was mainly the occupation of a kind of elite, of the town-oriented elites. And in Bulgarian case, the link to the history with medieval Bulgaria was very much perceived by very small but still influential strata around the church and later on around the merchant and educated class, which following Paisi Hilendarski's work from 1762, actually had a very clear understanding of the link with the former medieval Bulgarian kingdoms. The story of Paisi was a Slavonic one, so for the most of the period, the Slavonic nature of Bulgaria was perceived as a common knowledge, and there was no, let's say, big debate on it. Of course, later on in 19th century, with adoption once again from outside of different versions on who Bulgarians were, certain other ideas came, mainly from Western historians like Engel or certain others. So certain Bulgarians began to think that those proto-Bulgarians were very much important, and they were in fact a kind of Turanic tribe or Hunnic tribe or certain other non-Slavic tribe. Irecek spoke about Ugrofins, that proto-Bulgarians were of kind of Hungarian Finnish origin. So of course this was a kind of debate going on in Bulgarian society, but it was relatively bordered and circumscribed only to the small elite, and it was not a big, let's say, identity issue for the Bulgarians. It was a debate. It still is a debate in Bulgarian society, but not that big one. Let's put me this way.
Okay, thank you very much. And my second question. In Kingdom of Yugoslavia, people of nowadays North Macedonia wasn't recognized as a Macedonian or as a Serbs, but as a Bulgarians, as I heard, of course, and if there was any, and otherwise, why Serbian politician in Yugoslavia wanted to recognize them as a Bulgarians? Why doesn't they propose other ciekawe mi słowo.
Well, in fact, your judgment is not very much to the point, because after 1913 in Serbia and after 1918 in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, in fact, the population of Vardar Macedonia, or today North Macedonia, was proclaimed as a Serbian, and Macedonian or Bulgarian identity was not permitted. It was prosecuted. So this was an official policy of the interwar kingdom that after 1929 received its name Kingdom of Yugoslavia. This Bulgarian or Macedonian regional identity, Bulgarian national or Macedonian regional identity, was manifested in a number of times, but officially it was not recognized. We have a number of travelogues from the time, especially Rebecca West, the British women traveler, is quite famous, that has very specific references to the situation in what is today North Macedonia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? You can raise your hand with the option in MS Teams if you would like to ask a question. If not, I have two questions. Sorry, Dr. Adam Świątek has a question.
Thank you very much. Professor, I have only one, maybe general question in the context of this comparison between Bulgarian and Serbian nation building processes. Do you see, and if yes, how do you evaluate the participation of foreigners, foreign cultural, political activists in these processes in Bulgaria and Serbia? You have mentioned Konstantin Dilecek, for example, historian from Czech historian, and I think that in Bulgaria, especially in Bulgaria, there were more activists who came to Bulgaria and took a part in building of a state and Bulgarian culture. And how do you see this situation in Serbia, and could you make some comparisons between these two processes?
I think that we have more in common between Serbia and Bulgaria in the terms that the influence of the foreigners is mainly on certain upper level of society and certain upper level of state building. Konstantin Dilecek, that I mentioned, as you know, was General Secretary in the Bulgarian Ministry of Education, and very important in mainly in establishing the system and certain scientific establishments in Bulgaria. But when the textbook production and the mass education is concerned, it was accomplished by locals, by Serbians or Bulgarians, so the foreigners had not direct but only indirect influence through their notions, through narratives they created, and so on. For example, Bulgarian archaeology, to a greater extent, was established by the Polish Wacław Dobruski and certain other foreigners. So this is a natural phenomena. In Serbian case, the role of the foreigners was somewhat less, and in that case, the Serbians from Hungary, from Austro-Hungary, played a similar role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from our audience? If not, I will take advantage, and I have two questions. First one is because you mostly work on the Bulgarian and Serbian textbooks. I'm interested who were the enemies in these textbooks. Okay, so it is the question. Who Serbians want to pupils see the most important enemy in the textbooks in school education and so on in Bulgaria?
Speaking about the textbooks for the pupils in the school system, so definitely in the two countries, the main enemy is the Turk. That means both Ottoman and Muslim, but definitely connected with the Ottoman Empire. But the designation was Turk, not Ottoman at the time. And different images, different figures of that empire, of that enemy, were recreated. In Serbian case, once again, more created with Kosovo epics, 14th century. In Bulgarian case, with contemporary events, with Turkish subjugation of the brothers Bulgarian in Macedonia. Of course, later on, we had the contemporaneity of the Linden uprising of 1903 in Macedonia that was also included into those textbooks. Very modestly, Serbians and Bulgarians were recreated as mutual enemies, but still there was a certain tendency. In school, in textbook for the soldier, the same pattern is observed. But in Serbian case, we see very quick change after 1908, after the annexation crisis with Bosnia and Herzegovina, and very quickly the Austrian enemy is introduced into those manuals. But this is the phenomena only for the last several years before the Balkan Wars. This Austrian or German enemy is very, very marginal before.
Yeah, probably the Habsburg as the enemy would be problematic for army during, for example, last Obrenović, when they were dependent to Austria, Hungary. And what about Greeks in the case of Bulgarian textbooks? Because like at the beginning of the 20th century, there's quite strong anti-Greek feelings in Bulgarian society. We have events of 1905 and the anti-Greek movement. Are the textbooks one of the source of this anti-Greek sentiment or not?
More or less, the textbooks are very late to recreate those feelings in the society. Okay. So in general, there is a tendency to, let's say, to paint Greeks in certain negative light in Bulgarian literature. But because the Bulgarians as a ethnic or national community national community were formed by its separation from the big Rum millet that was dominated by the Greeks in 19th century. But nevertheless, these anti-Greek elements they exist in the textbooks, but they are not that important.
Okay, so like the Turk was the enemy number one. Okay.
The main enemy definitely is the Turk. That means Ottoman Empire, and geopolitically it's very easily to understand why this is so, because obviously it is expected that the territory of the Ottoman Empire somehow would have a different destiny.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question about the Slavic population in Niš and Pirot region. You said that there is some part of population who were closer to Serbian, and some of them were closer to Bulgarians. In the case of the Slavic population of Pirot, when more or less the process of Serbization of this population was finished, of course after that part of lands came under the Serbian rule?
Well, of course, we should distinguish between the town population and village population. And in the case of Pirot, we have a very, let's say, definite Bulgarian consciousness of that population. And in fact, Pirot was one of the seats of the Bulgarian Exarchat, of the diocese of the Bulgarian Exarchat, with very Bulgarian essence. Niš was also the other seat, but even before 1878, it was very much Serbianized, and Bulgarian bishop was very much pro-Serbian at the time. While in Pirot, we have a very different picture with very much normal Bulgarian national development going on, and Niš economically very much linked to Sofia as a commercial city. And of course, after the new borders were established, we have a process of emigration of people from Pirot to Bulgaria. And after 1885, after the Bulgarian-Serbian War, we have a process of about probably several dozen families being expelled by the Serbian authorities to a certain like exile out of Pirot. So it's difficult to evaluate, but obviously in the First World War we see not that much of a Bulgarian Pirot, and the final, let's say, Serbianization took part in that period in the years before the First World War. Whereas with the peasant population, the situation is much more simple, because it is much more naturally going on into the national mode of the state, that means the Serbian mode.
Yeah, in the situation when they became the Serbian citizens, for peasant it is easier to connect the national and the citizenship maybe. Okay, thank you for your answers. Okay, is there any more questions? We have a few more minutes if somebody would like to ask Professor a question. Okay. So I think we can stop with that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. It was really.
So let me thank you, Dr. Popek and Dr. Swiatek, for organizing this lecture, which was not that easy, judging the circumstances, but I'm really happy to be online with you and with your colleagues, and I hope that tomorrow we would continue on. So, that's right.
Yeah, of course. So I'm giving the floor to Adam Świątek, if he would like to say a few words at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I would like to say that this is a CEPUS program, and we have a possibility to invite Professor Naouma Kaytcheva. He is a coordinator of CEPUS program in Sofia at St. Klimenta Ochrydzkiego University, and I hope that in future we have some possibility to go to Sofia and Bulgarian historians come to Krakow. And it's not our last lecture now, because tomorrow we have the second lecture of Professor Naouma Kaytcheva about first half of 19th century. Krzysztof, could you say could you invite, because this meeting is co-organized by Instytucie Historii and Institute of Slavic Philology of Jagiellonian University.
Yes, I have pleasure to invite you on the second open lecture of Professor Naouma Kaytcheva. The lecture will be about Croatian national models and their relations with Serbians and Bulgarians in the first half of 19th century, specifically between the Vienna Congress and the Spring of Nations. The lecture will be via Google Meet platform. You need only the link to join that, and I have pleasure to invite all of you on that event.
Okay, so we invite, and thank you once again, Professor.
Thank you. Until
Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Tomorrow. Goodbye.
Yeah.